First off, I have a bit of an apology to make, and that's not just because I am Canadian, and that's how we do. The apology is because when I started to build this slide deck, I was reading the title that I put into the talk description, and I was like, this has to be the most boring talk description I have ever made. I don't even think I would go to this talk. And so let's fix that. Really, the theme of my talk today is about this concept about followship. And it is about organizational responses to that. So if you're here for that, you are in the right spot. I have spent much of my career looking into high risk, high consequence, high value work across a variety of domains. I've studied human factors and systems safety and cognitive systems engineering. And my work is both distant and objective and analytical, and it's also very deeply personal because it's part of the nature of what I study, systems engineering, which is largely about seeing the elements that need to function together to produce the capabilities required to meet a need, to deliver a resilient and reliable service in our case here. And it's about seeing these patterns, these interdependencies and performance under different kinds of conditions and the boundaries of those systems. So it is analytical, it is objective, it is kind of distant, but I'm a cognitive systems engineer. And so that means I have to get inside the heads and the lived experiences of the people that you're working with. And so that's a little bit of what I'm going to talk about here today, is both the lived experience, the system that people live and work and operate in, and this idea of how to help improve the coordination and the collaboration during really high risk, or during really high tempo, high pressure, and often quite stressful circumstances. And so a lot of what I talked about in my abstract was kind of this dichotomy, this idea about leadership and followship. And so we've long had this fascination with leaders who can articulate a vision or who inspire hope, who hold strong to what is right and what is just, even when they don't really look like leaders. And even when they decide that it's time to let somebody else lead. But leaders have power and they have impact when they're buoyed by followers. It's those who are swayed by the voices to honor our higher ideals or to believe in our own power to make change, to resist, to take action, or in what is an astonishingly difficult act, to take care of themselves. And so the central thesis for this talk here today is for us to think about what constitutes good following over good leadership, and specifically in how this relates to incident response in software. And so one of the core themes that came out of my dissertation research, and I'll talk a little bit about kind of where this theory kind of came from, or this model came from, was this idea of adaptive choreography. And I've been talking about this for about 3 or 4 years now, and adaptive choreography is not a tweetable phrase, and it has not caught on at all within the community, so we're gonna try this thing with followship instead. But what we're talking about when we talk about followship or we talk about adaptive choreography is how experienced responders, how any responders really, are working together for a common goal or a purpose. And it's the mechanics of how they do that collaboratively and how they do that together. So if we look at this in a typical incident command structure, this is typically what you'd see for how many companies organize and manage their incidents. You have an IC, you might have an ops lead, someone who's on the sort of planning side of things, and somebody who's communicating outward to stakeholders. And then you have, of course, the subject matter experts or the responders. But for many organizations, it actually looks like this. You spin up an incident channel and people pour into it, and you get occasionally sometimes that senior leader who mistakenly believes that their presence is actually adding value to the situation instead of making it just a whole lot more pressured. And in many organizations, the attention that we spend on incident response and incident management goes here. It's in the budget, it's in the training, in the scheduling, the preparations, the way we allocate accountability and responsibility. It goes here to the incident commander. But today, I want to talk about how attention here on what makes for good followers can be a force multiplier and have a really profound impact on your incident response. And so I will make it clear that I'm not saying that you shouldn't spend the time on training incident commanders and adding the resources and allocating time and budget there. What I'm saying is it's a yes and. And we don't typically do this, or I haven't seen this in the organizations that I've worked with. So some of the core kind of principles that are underlying why we would redirect focus from the incident commander to the followers has to do with what Woods and Patterson call the escalation principle. And so they started studying this at NASA, and they were looking at mission control about how do the multiple teams that are responsible for safe space exploration, space operations, how do they actually coordinate and communicate when things start to go sideways? And so an incident in that domain and in our domain as well typically begins with a lot of uncertainty. So there's a user post saying, I'm seeing something funny here, my jobs are failing, there's some lag in the system, is anybody else seeing this? And so concurrent with this rise of uncertainty, the cognitive demands start to rise. So these are the attentional demands. You start to look into it. You start to gather more information. You start to see who else, how widespread is this problem. You're trying to get more diagnostic data, and you're also starting to keep track of is this changing and how quickly is it changing? And you're starting to hold in your head these multiple lines of reasoning. It could be this, it might be that. And so as these cognitive demands start to rise, your ability to handle the concurrent coordinative demands start to go down. And the escalations that come with cognitive demands also increase the amount of coordinative demands, because in a degraded performance within the system or unexpected performance means more people start to come and start to find out what's going on. More people start asking, when is it going to be fixed? More people jump in and say, I'm here to help if you need. So we have this cognitive demand and coordinative demand that start to come up, and the ability to manage those coordinative demands start to come down. And so this kind of gives rise to this thing called the coordination paradox. And this is quite inherent in these large-scale distributed systems that we work in, is that everyone's understanding their mental model of how the system works, how it performs under different kinds of conditions, it's going to be necessarily partial and incomplete, because that system is always changing. You're geographically distributed. You've got a lot of different components that are working together. So we have this feature of these environments where no one's going to really know all the things that are required to respond for an incident response. And therefore, we need to have these multiple and often diverse sets of knowledge bases and perspectives on the problem to be able to handle when things go sideways, when you start to get beyond the kinds of problems that are already outlined in your run books or the kinds of typical and expected patterns of degradation. And so if we need these people in order to respond to our incidents, there is also this ongoing cognitive load, or an increase in cognitive load, that comes along with trying to pull all of these multiple perspectives together. And so you may experience this when you spin up the incident channel, and all of a sudden those 3,000 people hop into the channel, and everyone's trying to be helpful, or they're not. They're trying to figure out, what does this mean for them and the work that they're trying to get done. And so the escalation of those costs are adding to the already high cognitive load that's inherent in dealing with the uncertainty. And so I've added this bolded point here. This is kind of this coordination paradox is a question and a concept that I've been working with over the last couple of years. But really, it's about, this is a feature of this environment. And so what are the investments that we can make as organizations to help lower the costs of coordination? And what are the strategies that incident responders can use collectively within their teams that they're used to working with, or with new or ad hoc or emergent teams that start to come together? Because what we see, the strategies that are often used, which are kind of counterproductive to being able to resolve an incident in a timely fashion, is that we often move it out in time, we delay it, so we kind of defer dealing with different aspects of the problem. We give it to someone else by delegating, which increases our costs of coordination as well. We just won't do it, so we'll drop any kind of tasks or concurrent work that's going on around us. Or we diminish the effort that's required to actually deal with it. And so all of these strategies have follow-on and peripheral effects to them. If you're deferring other work, you're canceling a meeting that you're supposed to be in, or you're not working on your backlog because you're attending to interrupt-driven work, you are going to have additional costs, additional workload that's happening at a later point in time. And so how do we develop these strategies, these plans for keeping the cost of coordination low when we don't use these additional sort of strategies that have these adverse later effects? And so typically what we see with that model of using the incident commander and trying to have one person to control all of these things and to manage the event itself is that the incident commander has this inability to handle all of the cognitive and coordinative loads, and so they become this bottleneck, and they end up slowing down the incident response, because the pace at which the group is actually able to respond to the incident in real time is actually faster than it is for the incident commander to keep pace with the rate of change and the amount of complexity that's inherent in the work itself. And so as you get increasing pressure and increasing stress, this actually exacerbates this problem even worse. So to me, when I look at these problems, and you see this pattern play out again and again when you start to look closely at incident response, this is just underscoring the need to be developing these different kinds of ideas about how do we coordinate more effectively. And so what I've also seen in a lot of these cases is this is where things like freelancing starts to take place. People start taking initiative, and they're like, well, we still haven't had a sit rep of what's going on, but I think this thing is going to help. Let me go try and do that. And when they take their work offline, it can actually ironically slow down the pace of the response, because they're not coordinating effectively, they're not integrating their work and their perspectives effectively with the broader group. And it's also where we start to see side channeling, where the cost of coordination of being in a Zoom call or on an audio bridge or in a Slack channel with 3,000 other people becomes too high. And so I start to peel off with a smaller group, because it's easier for us to troubleshoot that way in these smaller groups. And again, where this can be actually quite a useful and helpful strategy for managing incident response if we're able to bring those disparate groups back together and integrate the work and the perspectives and the initiative that they're taking in a meaningful way. So this is where I keep coming back to this idea of, okay, if we have this problem of rising costs, of cognitive demands and costs of coordination, then what are some of the strategies that we can start to use to help bring people together around a common goal or purpose? And so let's understand, first of all, what makes the coordination hard so that we can make it a little bit easier. And so I got a little bit ahead of myself in kind of jumping into all the cool stuff around cost of coordination. But this actually comes from a number of different kind of streams of work that have been going on over the last, the literature goes back 20, 30, 40 years on this, but most recently in the last sort of 5 to 10 years. And so the first is the Snafu Catchers Consortium, which a number of the organizations that are here today were a part of funding that research and looking at how do site reliability engineers cope with complexity. And you can see the Stella report, Stella.report, is one of the byproducts of that body of work. The second is the Ohio State University. The Cognitive Systems Engineering Lab has been looking at the coordination and communication between human-human and human-machine teams for many years, including my own doctoral research there. And during that time, I looked at hundreds of cases of incident response in software. And then lastly, with the work that I'm doing at Jeli, with our customers and design partners, is we are trying to unpack this in a very real way to help them kind of improve their incident response as well. And you will see what I think is a really fascinating report that's coming out a little bit later this spring that details some of the ways in which software organizations in the industry are coping with complexity, the demands to do more with less, and how to kind of experiment with some of these different ways of coordinating. And so I want to just step into first talk a little bit about what do I actually mean when I talk about cognition and about cognitive work, so that we can get on the same page, because this is kind of one of those terms and one of those concepts where we talk about it and everybody thinks we're talking about the same thing, but it's useful to reduce some of those wildly different interpretations to have the same kind of mental model so that what I share later will make a little bit more sense. And so cognition, I put up 3 different definitions of what we mean by cognition here. The mental action or process of both acquiring knowledge. So how do you know the things that you know? What are the techniques and strategies that you use to learn things? And the acquisition, the processing, the storage and retrieval of information by the brain. And then lastly, all forms of knowing and awareness, such as perceiving, conceiving, remembering, reasoning, judging, imagining, and problem solving. And so the shorthand of all of this is we want to start looking at the thinking part of your work. And that seems like a very basic thing to do. It seems like a fairly self-explanatory thing to do because much of what you do is inherently cognitive. But the playwright Paul Thomas Anderson tells this parable during one of the commencement speeches that he gave about these 2 fish that are swimming around in a fishbowl. And as they're swimming, this older fish comes towards them, and he looks up and he says, "Morning, boys, the water's fine." And the 2 fish kind of swim on. And after a couple minutes, one fish looks to the other and says, "What the heck is water?" And that, to me, it illustrates perfectly a lot of what we talk about, or what we don't talk about when we talk about site reliability engineering work. The water that you swim in is inherently complex, it's cognitively demanding, and a lot of that work is very hidden, and it's not acknowledged and appreciated in many of the processes that we have in place, many of the strategies that we use to try and control and manage and organize work in these large systems. And that becomes problematic. That puts an extra burden and an extra stress on many of the responders who are tasked with keeping these systems upright. And so if it's difficult to see and it becomes really hard to talk about, and then it's also that many people are kind of uncertain with what to do with this knowledge about, we think at work. So the main sort of elements that I want to focus on here today about cognition is the perceptual or the seeing. So your ability to actually look into your system and get information, signals, and cues about what's happening, how quickly it's happening. Talk about the reasoning. So this is both the memory and the recall and application of knowledge. And I want to talk about the ability to focus attention, sort of like shining a flashlight on what's meaningful and important, given your goals and priorities of the moment. And of course, all of this is in service of creating actions that are designed to reduce the amount of time that you're spending responding to your incidents. And so when we talk about perceiving, we're looking. We are sensing, we are seeking cues and receiving cues, and we're recognizing change. So what we're doing here is we're trying to get information from the world about the state of not only the problem that we're facing, but the system that we're trying to maintain and the people that we're trying to work with. And so there's a variety of ways, of course, in which you get information from your systems, but your ability to perceive those cues is going to be limited or enhanced by the tools that you have set up, by the focus of your attention, and by how your team is actually structured around how to receive information from the variety of sources that you have available to you. the second sort of aspect of this, the reasoning part of it, and this is really the crux of like incident response practices. This is diagnosing, it's troubleshooting, it's trying to figure out what do we think is happening here, and then how do I validate or invalidate those hypotheses. It's inferring if X, then Y. It is judging what the most likely scenario is here so that you can go and either collect more information, more cues from the world around you. And then it's that planning and correcting and modifying that you are constantly doing as new information comes in or as the goals and priorities of the situation change over time. And the attending aspect of it has to do with how we manage our attention during an incident. And so typically the most urgent, the loudest, or the most painful aspects of the incident are what gets attention. But that's not always what is the most useful to actually resolving the incident or to being able to understand what's really happening. And so by looking at and trying to understand more readily, how do people focus their attention during an incident? How do they prioritize where they use their limited attention? And then how do they switch to other aspects of the problem in order to gather more information or other aspects of the expectations? And also, what do they ignore? And so when we start to look at incident practices or we start to look at incidents and the cases that we see, some of this stuff starts to surface up and you say, oh, this becomes a perception problem or this is an attentional problem. And so we can get more specific about the kinds of strategies that we use and the types of tools that we deploy to be able to help support this work. And then, of course, the acting part of it. So as you are interpreting information from the world around you, you're synthesizing it, you are making sense of it, you are recruiting new perspectives to be able to fill those gaps in your mental models. You are synchronizing as people come in or go out of the incident because they have other work that's going on, or they have to go pick up their kids, or they are otherwise sort of unavailable. And it's the initiating, updating, delegating, accepting, and adjusting. And so again, the more specific we can get about how incident response is taking place, the more we can fine-tune the practices across your team. So let's do a little bit of a practice exercise in recognizing cognitive work. How many of you were on the learning new skills or activities during the early days of the pandemic? Oh, okay. All right. What did you learn? What did you learn about? A thing.
I learned about how safety practitioners and safety people who work in safety do their activities in various industries.
You learned about safety practitioners and how they do that in various industries. Nerd. I love it. Sourdough. We got a sourdougher. Where's my knitters? Do we have some knitters in the crowd? Okay, crocheters. All right. What? Plants. Yes. Okay. What else did we do? Painters. Okay. Piano. Okay.
Fermentation.
Do you want to know what I did? Fermentation. Nice. Do you want to know what I did? What did I do? I learned how to fly. I mean, it really is the ultimate social distancing activity. But if you're someone who's really fascinated with cognition and with understanding sense-making in the kinds of activities where quickly and accurately making sense of risk and then responding quickly and accurately is critical, then paragliding is complete and utter intellectual catnip. And I couldn't go out and study others' cognition at that point in time, and so I studied my own. Is there any other pilots in the crowd? Okay, we got one at the back here. Yeah. So what I want to do here is I am going to, or let me tell you a little bit about what I learned. So I learned about all new equipment that's out there and all the flight tools. I learned about the aerodynamics of flight, about meteorology and weather. I learned about safe site selection. I learned about launching and landing and flying techniques. And all of these things where I was activating and storing and creating the structures to be able to extend that knowledge and to express that knowledge when you actually get into flight. And so if you think about the 4 cognitive processes that we talked about of perceiving, reasoning, attending, and then acting, when you are about to run yourself off the mountain, you are doing these things in real rapid time. And I will suggest that this is a lot like when you are responding to an incident. And so what I want you to do is I want you to take a look at this video and tell me what you think that you see in terms of the cognitive work that's going on. And if you have some anxiety around heights, please be aware that there is some running off the edge of a mountain involved here. Okay, so what are we seeing about information about whether it's safe to fly here? Wind, yeah. Traffic, yeah, we can see around us. We can see if there's other people on launch. What do you think I'm reasoning about here? Is it safe? Yeah. Am I going to be able to get the wing up and over? Am I going to be able to launch safely? As I'm in the air, what am I doing?
You're adjusting your arms.
I'm steering, I'm adjusting my arms. Yeah, so questioning my life choices. Yeah, so what I'm doing there is I am interpreting and perceiving the world in real time, and I am reasoning about, is this safe to do? And if it's safe to do, what kinds of adjustments am I gonna have to make when I'm in the air? And I will tell you something about attending when you are up on launch is that you do not focus on anything else but that wing that's right in front of you, because that is the only thing that is keeping you, up and in the air at that point in time. So yeah, so the how quickly that took place is kind of what happens in day-to-day work with incident response as well. And you don't notice it and you don't realize how quickly and how smoothly and how sophisticated a lot of these processes actually are. But when things break down, like when you don't have a windsock, or when you can't see the landing, or when there's something that interrupts the processes of reasoning about the risk that's occurring, these things can really disrupt and impede your ability to actually act and respond appropriately. So cognitive work then is about asking and answering what is happening, why is it happening, and what is going to happen next, and how quickly is this going to happen? What can I do now versus later? What can I sort of defer in time if I need to? What are the consequences of this information that I'm receiving about the world around me? And what are the goals and priorities, and which ones am I able to sacrifice if things start to fall apart? And that one is really important in a software setting, in an organizational setting, because you are all making trade-off decisions. The decision to keep the system down a little bit longer so that you can gather more information about the nature of the problem and about what's happening versus getting it back up so you can meet your SLO. The coordinative work then is about asking, who do I have available? We've got things falling apart. I need to bring their perspectives in. Who do I know is available, and how do I get a hold of them? And then what kinds of information do I have to provide them about the situation to be able to make them useful? Because again, remember, a lot of stuff is happening and the coordination costs need to be quite low for me to be able to handle all of what's happening. So what tasks should I give Nick instead of giving Clint? All of that depends on my knowledge about what Nick's capabilities are and what Clint's capabilities and availability is. How long is it going to take? What other kinds of work are we pushing off by pulling them into this incident? Because there's consequences inherent in that as well. And then what does it mean for my users if we're seeing a little bit of degraded performance, and how and when should I let them know? So SRE work is then about asking and answering all of these questions in real time. And this is a very busy slide. Like, this is the kind of slide that they tell you in like public speaking courses to like never put up there because it's too much. And yet this is all of what you are handling under conditions of uncertainty and time pressure and stress. And so early on in my research, I showed this to an SRE team that I'd been observing, and he was like, oh man, no wonder I am exhausted at the end of an incident. Because yes, this is the water that you swim in. There are extensive cognitive and coordinative demands that take place during an incident report or an incident response. And this work often gets ignored or it gets minimized when we start thinking about how to design tools and processes to actually support cognition. And so I know a lot of people were like, yeah, we know this. That's why we have an incident commander. But a key finding from my research is that you can't just actually assign coordination to one person, that everybody pays a cost in coordination. And so what we want to do is look at the secret to lowering the overall costs of coordination to help responders understand how to share that across their team and how to be intentional about when and how they push those costs onto other people or across organizational boundaries. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So when we think about followship, when we start to kind of like look at the mechanics of what this actually is, it's about anticipating the sequencing of work needed to be accomplished and of other people's needs in the incident response itself. And so in an incident, this looks like someone coming in and saying, I'm ready to deploy that change whenever you finish reviewing it. Or, well, I'm going to hold off on asking the network team until we have the results back. Initiating work and communications and outreach is an important part of being a good follower. And so this is things like, yeah, I know how to get a hold of this person and you just let me know I'm ready to pull them in. Or I'm gonna open a ticket so that we are ready to recruit these other needed perspectives. I'll work on messaging. I'll get prepared and get ready to take the next step. It's about signaling to other people that you are aiding their coordination. And so it's like, I'm in the database, I'm able to run those queries, or if this is a late night thing, I'm gonna put the kids to bed and then I'm gonna order pizza so that everybody gets dinner. So it's about signaling to others that you have an intent to coordinate and what you're actually going to do, what kinds of things you're going to take on. So I have a kind of a simple example of what this actually looks like when it's done well, when you're anticipating, when you are initiating, and when you are signaling to others. And it's traffic. People in this situation, they know how traffic works. They know what it's like to drive and what's needed to keep the traffic moving. So they're continually adjusting their actions relative to the flow of events that are unfolding in real time. Sometimes they're slowing down, sometimes they're speeding up. They're signaling their intentions to others by where they're looking or how they're using their turn signal. And so to me, this is a really marvelous example of what it's like to be in a very well-orchestrated incident. In the dance of morning rush hour traffic, everyone here knows this choreography for smooth performance to get there on time. How many of you have actually been in an incident response that felt like this? Yeah, it's amazing. So what I want to do is help us get to a place where this becomes the standard. And I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that there's a lack of controllers in that situation. There was no traffic light and no police there, and yet it worked. And so this is actually a very powerful and quite exciting way to think about incident response, because the current paradigms that we have are all thinking about control, and they're all thinking about limiting. And that's not necessarily what's needed. So following on of what good followship looks like, it's about proactively providing information and updates and also stating the assumptions that you have about the event. I think that the payments team might have launched this new feature that might be causing our issues, or I'm almost done restarting the server here. It's about relaxing goals and constraints to show reciprocity. And so when you are working across boundaries and you're working across other teams and jointly, sometimes you have to put aside your work or your goals or your priorities to be able to help out another team with the assumption that if the situation was reversed, they would extend the same courtesy to you. And it's about preparing yourself to be useful and synchronizing activities. And so we tend not to notice these kinds of things because they just happen. And so we minimize their importance when we think about coordination strategies. So this is an interesting exchange between a small group of responders that were working on synchronizing their activities. So what kinds of examples of cognitive work do you actually see here? You just shout them out whenever you see one. Acknowledgement, okay. Yeah, they're providing information about the status of their tasks. Asking clarifying questions, yeah, so I want to make sure I've got the right thing going on here.
Expressing gratitude.
Yeah, okay, expressing gratitude, so that's kind of helping ease the social issues or pressure there. Feeling discouraged? Oh, sharing experience, yes, yeah. So what we're seeing here is a lot of this actually quite sophisticated coordination. There's anticipation, there's sequencing of events here, there's providing information and taking initiative, there's updating others to help everyone have a collective understanding of where the situation is at. So lastly, in preparing themselves to be useful, this is like where people go in and read the back scroll. They remove the cost of coordination of coming up to speed because they start to prepare themselves to be able to be useful. And so the last one I'll say, the looking in and listening in, I think this one was quite an impactful finding in the studies that I did, because we often say, everybody's like, rubbernecking on the incident channel and they're just kind of hanging out in there. But I can't tell you the amount of times where the only thing that someone said in an event or in an incident was where they were just sort of lurking, was to ask a question or make a statement that ended up reframing the problem for the responders and helping them resolve the problem. And that's because they are not suffering the cognitive demands and the cognitive overheads. They can start to look more broadly at the problem. So developing a base for followship relies on having good common ground. And this is this mutual knowledge and beliefs and assumptions about the state of the problem and about the system that you're actually working in. And so when you have this, when you have good knowledge about the team that you're working with, you have deep technical knowledge about the technical system that you're working on, you have knowledge about what are the goals and priorities and constraints, and which ones is your organization willing to sacrifice and which ones will it absolutely not. And you have knowledge about others who rely on you or who you rely on. All of this basis helps make coordination easier. And when you don't have it, it requires more effort, communication, and coordination to help things go right. So if we think about a little thought exercise around this, think about the last time you had dinner with a really good friend or your spouse or a member of your family. How difficult was it to actually pick the restaurant? It was probably reasonably easy because you have knowledges about their preferences and tastes. You might know the last time they visited a certain restaurant, and so whether they'd want to go there or not. If they have dietary restrictions, if there's other constraints like needing to be home at a certain point in time. Now think about having dinner with me. The answers around where we would eat, where we would go, when, for how long, who else would come, it's all going to be a whole lot harder because we lack the common ground that we would need to be able to establish our goal of going out and enjoying the meal. And so establishing, maintaining, and repairing breakdowns in common grounds is crucial for understanding or for smooth coordination. And so here's an illustration of this from an incident that I studied. And so in this, the users at a really large global service company had begun reporting errors in their code repository. And so they tried to recruit the vendor engineers, vendor support engineers to get help because they had needed access to information and perspective that they didn't have. But the request that they got back was to run these service bundles. And so this kind of introduced a whole lot of lag into the response time. And so it meant that the team had to, that the process actually took several hours. And so this organization, after he had sort of looked at the support bundles, he said, well, I'm seeing like a big spike in traffic here. And the engineer kind of came back and said, yeah, this is business as usual for us. This is not like an anomaly. This is not an outside. And the distance between message 1 and message 4 was 4 hours, when if they were able to sort of coordinate more effectively and get into the same communication channels, this would have been resolved in minutes. And so this lack of common ground can be really detrimental and add to your mean time to response. And so just like having organizational context and common ground can help eliminate wasted time and effort, so too can having good context about your fellow responders. Like, where are they located? So you know if they need to stop for lunch or dinner, or if a handoff are needed. How long have they been in their role? How much or how little do they typically involve or engage in the incident response, so you can start to see if they're overwhelmed or stressed. And knowing this can help you to preemptively take them off call or check in to see if their team is properly resourced. And it also allows for that reciprocity, for being able to understand what are the goals and priorities of other people that you're trying to coordinate with, so that you can give when you're able to give, so that you can get when you need to get. And having good common ground makes it easier to dynamically reconfigure. And so a very common pattern is being able to have these ad hoc and emergent teams. And this is an example from a recent incident that we actually had, and what you could see is sort of the time at which everybody joined. And what's interesting here is that the diversity of folks that joined at different points in time allowed us to bring these multiple diverse perspectives together to be able to resolve the incident quite quickly. So when we think about, so I'm coming into the last spot here, when we think about the organizational responses, when there's difficulties in handling the cognitive and coordinative costs of coordination, it's often the folks on the other side of the keyboard that get blamed. Why did it take so long? Why did it take so many people? Why didn't you minimize the impact to customers? And how can we stop this from ever happening again? And you get kind of, your stomach goes into a little bit of a knot, because you know there's a possibility that it will happen again. So how does that actually make you feel? And it's kind of a rhetorical question, because of course it makes you feel unfairly judged or vilified or uneasy or guilty or ashamed or any number of feelings. But most importantly, how does it change the way you work? Because when the cognitive and coordinative costs are not accounted for in incident response, people feel blamed, and they have apprehension and fear and helplessness around their ability to actually articulate why things were difficult, not just why it took so long. So this tends to drive a lot of really important information underground, and it limits that sharing and reciprocity and relaxing of goals that helps keep coordination very smooth. So these anti-patterns around shaming, blaming, and retraining, or the mean time to innocence factor, which is like, it's not me, it's not my service, somebody else, that ends up pushing the cost of coordination across boundaries. And so if this is an internal team that you're trying to work together, you're ultimately inhibiting the ability of the organization to work effectively together. So the 3 things I'll leave you with here is to observe, to talk, and to analyze about cognitive and coordinative demands. So watch what happens when your team works together. Make it a practice to not only look for examples of leadership and initiative, but also of followship, where your team actually supported each other for the sake of smooth coordination. So look at, how do they interact with one another? Do we have good common ground? Are people comfortable, or are they stressed out? Do they support one another? An obvious component of helping improve coordination is to talk about it. But to enhance good fellowship, it's important to get good at talking about not only what it looks like, sounds like, and how well it went or how well it didn't when you're working with the participants. So some of that is about developing this shared language, and a number of the concepts that we talked about here about the cognitive work or the cognitive processes and the ways in which you work together can help you get more specific about where breakdowns may have happened or where it went really well and went very smoothly. And lastly, of course, incident analysis is my jam. So of course I'm going to recommend that you do this, that you look closely. And a lot of what we were able to surface with this research was by looking closely at incidents. And so when we look closely at post-incident analysis, and I think Clint gave us a really good example there of like the kinds of insights that you can start to see, the different things that you can see in your organization, it's not only about how the technical system failed or how it behaves under certain conditions, but it's about what was happening with the people, with the coordination aspects, whose knowledge was needed, how flexibly were people able to take that knowledge and apply it to the problem, and how easy or difficult was it to get help when your knowledge was insufficient. And so taking a closer look at your incident response, you can make notes of how the incident was handled as well as what was handled. You can notice where your knowledge islands exist, where information was available or where it was difficult to recruit the needed investigators, where your runbooks failed and where adaptation had to take place, and where you can see stress and uncertainty. And you can start to ask about how that felt and how it might have interrupted the smooth coordination there. So of course, I wouldn't be a good researcher if I didn't leave you with a whole bunch of references and reading. So I'll give you a second there to take a picture of that. And then I, of course, am always interested in hearing, oops, I'll go back for you there, Alex. I'm always interested in hearing a little bit about how these topics land. I went a little long, so I won't have any questions, but you can come find me afterwards at the booth or out in the hallway. Thank you so much.